started, and I'm going to be, is that on? I'm going to be talking about impact comparison. I think impact comparison is a very important part of debate. As you all hopefully realized during the sort of practiced demo debate that you all got and you all saw on Saturday, when you were thinking about how you were going to vote in that debate and listening to how other people in your lab voted and whatnot, you probably noticed that the way that debates should be resolved, it always revolves around thinking about the costs and benefits of the plan. You don't end up watching a debate and saying, well, I thought that the neg made these really 4 good points. They were really good on uniqueness, and they were really convincing in the cross-X here, and the AF was really good here, so it's 4-2 for the neg. 4 good points to 2 good points. It doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. What ultimately matters is asking yourself the question, is the plan that the affirmative provided better than the status quo, the way things are now, or a competitive alternative? And that's really the central question of debate. And in order to do that, we often end up in situations where there are sort of relative risks on both sides. The AF might do some stuff to help reduce the risk of global warming, but it might also raise electricity prices and create some risks for the economy. So we have to ask, what do we care more about? Do I care more about preserving economic growth, or do I care more about preventing global warming? And impact comparison is the part of debate that centers on that direct comparison. How do you go about arguing that one set of impacts or one set of harms is more important than another one? In doing so, there are generally 3 categories along which we compare impacts. Are any of you familiar with those terms or know what I'm getting at? Mm-hmm.
Magnitude, risk, and time frame?
Yeah. There's kind of 3 big categories. One is magnitude. Two is risk or probability. My handwriting's terrible. I apologize in advance. It's pretty hard for you to see like lower than that, so I'm going to use 2 quotes. And 3 is time frame. So when we say magnitude, what are we referring to? Here.
Like how big of like a terrible impact that.
Okay.
Like, how big of like an effect.
How big, size, magnitude, that makes sense. But what does that mean? Like, which one is bigger? Global warming or economic collapse?
I guess it depends how you argue it, but it's like whichever will affect the most people usually.
Yeah. Generally, we operate from the presumption that we're trying to preserve the most number of lives. And so when we're talking about magnitude, we're literally talking about how many people would die as a result of one of these things versus the other thing. So magnitude is literally just how big is it? How many people would be harmed? Generally, how many people would die, but you could argue that certain things are, worse than death or at least on par with death if you're talking about sort of other impacts like rape or poverty that aren't necessarily immediately ending in death but are still obviously of high magnitude. So there are different ways you could do that comparison, but in general, the category of magnitude refers to the number of people affected. Probability or risk is somewhat trickier. On one level, it sort of seems easy. It's just like, how likely is it that this would happen? But one thing that gets very easily mixed together and is important to differentiate is that when we're doing impact comparison, there is a difference between the probability of the impact and the probability of the set of links that lead to that impact. So, when we're talking about the electricity prices disad, for example, there's a host of factors that go into that. Are electricity prices low now? Is the plan actually going to increase them? Would that actually affect the manufacturing sector? Is the manufacturing sector actually that important to the economy? All of these are questions that you would have to answer. So you might go ahead and say, well, the AF sort of said that manufacturing wasn't that important, and they said that electricity prices were already high, and they said the economy's already doing poorly, and so it just doesn't seem like the next impact is that likely, so it's low probability. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about probability. We're trying to bracket out that part of the debate. There are obviously relative risks between different arguments. In any given debate, you're going to have to evaluate how likely is it that the AF kills the economy? How likely is it that the AF solves global warming? But then you have to ask another question. how important is global warming versus how important is the economy? And that's the question that we're trying to bracket out. So this is separate from how likely is it that the AF solves something or how likely is it that the AF causes something. This is just a question of if that thing happened, how likely would it be for the terminal end consequence to happen? So in the context of the electricity prices just said, if the economy did decline, how likely would that be to produce conflict between nations? Not how likely is it that the AF affects the economy. When we're talking about global warming, we're not asking how likely is it that offshore wind would solve global warming. We're instead asking how likely is it that global warming would cause sea level rises or resource conflicts or diseases to spread, etc. Does that distinction make sense? Okay. Finally, when we're talking about time frame, the same thing is true. Time frame refers to how quickly something would happen, but again, that's referring to the impact itself. How quickly would those things manifest? If the economy declined, would wars happen overnight? Would it take a while? Would it require sort of changes in countries' political structure before that started manifesting in conflict? It's not the question of how quick is the link. So oftentimes people will be debating this and they'll say something like, oh, well, the AF, they don't solve global warming for a while. It's a long-term impact. The plan raises electricity prices immediately. And it may well be true that the electricity prices dissad has a quicker time frame than the impact of global warming, but the reason is not because the AF increases prices immediately. The reason is because there is a faster connection between the economy going down and a war happening than there is between CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere and consequences being felt from that. It doesn't necessarily mean that global warming is less important. That's the whole point of debating impact comparison and comparing the relative value of magnitude versus time frame versus probability. But when we're talking about time frame, we're talking about how quickly would the impact scenario that the team is describing unfold. If the global economy collapsed, how quickly would conflict arise? Within these three categories, there's sort of a bunch of different ways that you can compare within the categories and then between the categories. So when you're looking at two impacts, you can ask yourself which has bigger magnitude, which is more probable, which has a quicker time frame. You can also then ask yourself what's more important, magnitude or time frame, probability or magnitude. So I'm going to first talk about ways to compare within impacts. What are ways to compare the relative magnitude of impacts against each other? The first and I think easiest category for comparing impacts is when one impact is inclusive of another impact. Does anyone have any idea what I mean by that? Mm-hmm.
That means one impact already causes another impact. If there's a certain impact, like let's say you're proposing that one is of a higher magnitude than the other one, if that impact happens, then the other smaller magnitude impact will happen anyways.
Okay, that's pretty much correct. There is, the language of causes is slightly different because there's a category of arguments referred to as turns case arguments that I'll talk about in a little bit, and that's when one impact would actually cause another. Would economic decline increase or decrease the risk of global warming? When I'm talking about something being inclusive, what I mean is that the impact is basically a subset of the other one. So for example, if one team said that a certain conflict would cause a war between China and Taiwan, something will happen, if wind power trades off with China and that leads to instability within the CCP and the Chinese government needs to make a big nationalist grab to maintain their hold on power, so they invade Taiwan. So we have this whole scenario for China invading Taiwan. The other team's impact is that if the global economy declines, that all countries will sort of lose internal political stability, countries will need to start fighting over resources, countries will need to engage in diversionary conflicts to preserve their political control, and so just conflicts will happen across the world. Well, one of those impacts, the economy impact, is describing a series of global conflicts. And that's inherently inclusive of a China-Taiwan conflict, which is one regional conflict. The same thing is generally true of any regional conflict scenario. If one team says that something would cause a war in the Middle East, and the other team says that something would cause global conflicts, global conflicts would probably involve wars in the Middle East. If the global economy declines and countries were fighting each other over resources, there would likely be conflicts in the Middle East. The second sort of way that impacts can be compared on magnitude is just with evidence, basically, and other or just sort of analytical comparison. And that obviously, like, well, they can be compared via comparison. That's silly. Basically, what I'm saying is that there are certain people who write evidence that directly compares two consequences. So if you're debating about global warming, there are certain people who have compared the risks of global warming to nuclear war. And are like, here are reasons that global warming is more consequential than nuclear war. Another good example is with biological weapons versus nuclear conflict. There's some great evidence that's not from Ox in 2002, and that card should be set on fire and never read again, that says that biological weapons are a greater threat than nuclear weapons because nuclear winter theory is wrong, and nuclear war wouldn't cause extinction. It would just incinerate the people who get blown up by nuclear bombs. Whereas biological weapons could be engineered to basically create vaccine-resistant smallpox that would just spread globally and kill everyone. And there's just a card that directly makes this comparison. So obviously, if you have something like that, that's pretty sweet. It makes your job easy. You don't even really have to like do impact comparison. You can just read this card and be like, this impact is more important than that impact. So says this person with a PhD in like random international security and disease control stuff. Seems sweet. But you can also try and make those comparisons just analytically about which do you think would be bigger. So some of them just may or may not be less obvious. Like if one team says that there would be a conflict between Iran and Israel, and the other team says that there's going to be a nuclear war between Russia and the United States, like both of those seem pretty bad, but one of them seems pretty logically bigger than the other because two of those countries have thousands of nuclear weapons, and the other ones have like 13. So one just seems bigger. So that sort of comparison might make sense. But then you might be stuck in a situation where you're like, okay, one team's impact is that Russia will fight China. Russia and China will get into a border war over their water disputes in northeast China. And the other team's impact is a war between India and Pakistan. Which one of those is bigger? Anyone have any thoughts? What do you think?
The India-Pakistan war would affect more people because the population in both areas is pretty high. However, with both of those nations possessing large amounts of nuclear weapons, China and Russia, having the world's largest nuclear arsenal, that could escalate pretty quickly. So I would have a war between the allies of Russia and China.
All right. There's some impact comparison right there. That's impact comparison. That's what you do. Seriously. Just made an argument. You know, you may or may not agree with that argument, but he just made an argument for why we should care more about Russia-China war than Indo-Pakistan war. Does anyone have a different opinion? There's no correct answer.
I don't know that it necessarily matters whether the two countries have 13 nuclear weapons or 10,000 nuclear weapons, because it's not like Russia's going to be able to like deploy their entire like arsenal of nuclear weapons all at once, and B, I don't think it would like matter in the.
Okay, so which one would be bigger then? Or which one do you think would be worse?
They'd be like the same.
They'd be like the same? Probably true, honestly. Yeah.
I think once you push that certain payload, then you talk about nuclear winter, because a couple of nuclear bombs don't create nuclear winter. But after a certain amount, you get the nuclear winter, and the result after that, it becomes just, okay, we have more, but we still have the max from light and fire.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. So like the number of weapons that get blown up is also important, but the places where those weapons get blown up is also important. So for example, basically any nuclear weapon strike can either be a counter force or a counter value strike. A counter force strike is using the nuclear weapon against a military target. I'm going to blow up this military base. I'm going to blow up this other person's nuclear missile silo, etc. A counter value strike is I'm going to blow up some part of their infrastructure or a city. Counter value strikes obviously kill more people because if you blow up New York, you blow up everyone in New York. But counter value strikes are also worse for the nuclear winter effects because when you blow up a bunch of buildings, you shoot a bunch of soot up into the atmosphere, which then causes nuclear winter because there's a giant cloud of soot that just instantly decreases global temperatures by like a degree or two. And on one level, you're like, well, global warming's bad, so decreasing global temperature seems sweet. But not if you decrease global temperature by like a full degree, like instantaneously, it turns out that plants and animals don't really know how to handle that, and it's pretty bad. So, obviously if one country only has like 10 nuclear weapons, they might not have enough nuclear weapons to actually trigger nuclear winter. But also, if two countries are fighting when they have denser population centers, like India and Pakistan, for example, they're very likely to cause nuclear winter because of all that soot. So there's in fact a bunch of the studies that scientists have done on nuclear winter theory use India and Pakistan as the example, and sort of one of the lower thresholds says that an India-Pakistan war with, what is it 50 or 100 weapons? Do you remember what the Robot card says?
Oh, 50.
I think it's 50. These scientists were like, a nuclear war between India and Pakistan with 50 nuclear weapons would be enough to cause nuclear winter that would basically destroy the Earth. Anyway, that was fun. That's comparison. That's magnitude. Probability, there's a few different ways you can compare impacts probabilities against each other. One is to compare structural impacts against event impacts. So a structural impact is basically something that it doesn't make a specific prediction. It's not like, if this happens, if the economy declines from electricity prices, then, the U.S. will invade Latin America for who knows why. I don't know, like some very specific thing. Or if China loses wind power industry, their economy will decline, this will make the CCP feel weak, so the CCP will feel a need to attack Taiwan in order to restore their credibility with the nationalist base. Those are like event-based predictions. They involve a specific set of things, A leading to B, leading to C. And there are lots of different disadvantages or advantages that have these sort of predictions, or that claim to have sort of very specific events, particularly things that deal with sort of current events a lot. So towards the end of last year, someone might have been reading impacts about the things going on between Russia and Ukraine. And they would likely have a bunch of sort of very specific, temporally immediate predictions about what is going to happen and who's going to fight who and how those things are going to play out. A structural impact, rather than relying on a particular scenario, just says that some consequence is more or less likely given a structural change in the world. So a sort of classic example of that is a hegemony impact. Some of you all may or may not be familiar with that, but one of the common impacts in debate, or an impact that you'll hear a lot, has to do with hegemony, which is the idea of having one powerful or one most powerful nation in the international system. And there's a big debate both ways. A lot of people say that when there's one very powerful country in the international system, that they essentially act as sort of the world's police force and deter other countries from fighting with each other, and that makes conflict less likely. There's also a set of people who say the opposite, say that when there's a bunch of countries that are of equal power, that they're less likely to mess with each other because they know that the risks are high, and when there's one country that's really powerful, that it creates an incentive to sort of bandwagon and counterbalance against them and leads to conflict and whatnot. That sort of debate about whether or not hegemony is stabilizing or not stabilizing doesn't rely on a particular set of predictions or a particular set of events. It just makes a broad structural claim. So to think about it, if one team said that creating offshore wind would trade off with China's wind industry, lead to its CCP instability, and lead to a China-Taiwan war, well, if we did offshore wind and, China did not invade Taiwan, then their impact was obviously disproven. Whereas if someone says hegemony makes conflict less likely in the international system, and then someone says, well, hey, there's a random conflict over here, does that actually disprove the entire claim? No, because they're not saying that hegemony means there's no conflict. They're just saying that hegemony means there's less conflict. So one particular thing can't entirely disprove it. So which do you think is generally more likely? Something that a structural impact or an event impact? Yes, a structural impact is almost always more likely because it doesn't rely upon the exact correct set of conditions playing out for an impact to happen. Another way to compare is to talk about impacts that are systemic. And systemic impacts are basically things that keep happening. They're built into the system that is the world. It's not like one thing. Like a China-Taiwan conflict wouldn't happen and then happen again and then happen again. There would either be a war between China and Taiwan or there wouldn't. It's a yes or no. An impact like poverty isn't an impact that just happens or doesn't happen. It's an impact that is built into the system of the world and has consequences that manifest every day over and over and over for millions of lives. Now, that impact, while it might seem smaller to people who are caught up in a world of nuclear conflicts and global warming, is an impact that is certainly more probable. It is in fact 100% probable because it is happening right now. There are currently people in poverty. People are suffering from that. There are people who are dying of malnutrition as we speak. China and Taiwan are not launching nuclear weapons at each other as we speak. So one is obviously more likely than the other. So impacts that are systemic are almost always more probable. They're generally smaller in terms of magnitude, but they're certainly more probable.
So is that kind of like the argument that if something is going on in the world now and the impact is this problem is magnified by doing XYZ, is that a systemic impact?
What do you mean magnified by? Like, give me an example.
Like, so, say, I'm just taking last year, like, there are people in poverty in Cuba, and if we do the plan, Castro is going to be harsher, and those people, there's going to be more people in poverty, and this impact is going to be more widespread.
Yeah, sure. That is an example of a systemic impact. And the AF team might have said the opposite. They might have said people are suffering because they don't have access to food or medicine, and if we lift the Cuban embargo, that'll help it. Those are both examples of systemic impacts in either direction. That make sense? All right. A third category, a third way to talk about probability, and this is probably getting low enough that you all probably can't actually read it, but it's not that important, is to talk about intervening actors. What I mean by this is basically saying that certain impacts are less likely if there are a variety of people who would have the opportunity to stop them. So any sort of nuclear war impact, for example, someone's got to press a button at some point. Things are going down between China and Taiwan. The U.S. has a treaty. We got to defend Taiwan. We got to think about what we're going to do. Are we going to deploy the aircraft carriers? Let's say we do. We deploy our aircraft carriers. China responds. They start putting their missiles on alert. China launches a missile. We don't know if it's nuclear or not. What do we do? There's always a moment where somebody's got to press the red button. And that person who has to press the red button, they always have the option at that last minute of being like, you know what? I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that person that starts a nuclear war. It's never happened before, so you'd be the first person. You'd be like, go down as like, well, you've officially killed more people than anyone else in the history of the human species. Congratulations. You generally want to avoid doing that. So people, they kind of have a natural inbuilt resistance to, slaughtering millions of innocent lives. And someone's got to press that button, and they might be less willing to do it. Someone might step in and talk them down at the last minute, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were really close in the 1960s to having a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But, we had a bunch of people in a room trying to decide what to do. We're like, well, the Soviets just put all these missiles in Cuba, 50 miles away from our coast. That's really sketch. We don't really know what they're going to do with that. We flew some spy planes over that. They didn't like that very much. They started alerting their stuff. There's a lot of tension. We blockaded Cuba. They were like, we're not cool with you blockading Cuba. Tensions were high. There was a large chance. There was, in fact, a moment where Russian ships were trying to come through the U.S. blockade of Cuba, and there were U.S. submarines and Russian submarines that were both protecting those ships. And the Russians were just given orders to ignore our blockade, just sail past it. And when they sailed past it, there was sort of some ambiguity about whether or not the U.S. was going to fire on them or not. And some depth charges were dropped, which are like things you drop to like mess with a submarine. And this one submarine, Russian submarine, lost communication, is rattled by this depth charge, and it's just like, oh my god, conflict is starting. They're like, system for communicating with people is down. They get hit by a depth charge, or like, stuff is going down. This Russian submarine was armed with nuclear torpedoes. Now, fortunately for all of us, they had a policy that there were 3 sort of head commanders on this Russian submarine, and they had to have a unanimous decision to use nuclear weapons. It was a 2-1 vote in favor of using nuclear weapons, which means there is literally one human being who is responsible for preventing nuclear war between the United States and Russia at that moment. If that one Russian submarine commander votes yes, nuclear war would have started. But they didn't, because there's a high resistance to doing those sort of things. So the idea of intervening actors is that there are certain impacts where people have the option of sort of backing down from the brink or stepping in to deal with something. When you think about an impact like global warming, there's no kind of just like, you know, we emit some carbon into the atmosphere, we're getting down the road, it's now like 2065, New York doesn't exist anymore, the sea level's 30 feet higher, and people are like, you know what, we shouldn't have done this, let's just call it off. You know, there's no stepping back from the brink. Like once we release that stuff into the atmosphere and start feeling climate effects, there's not too much that can be done. But you could argue there are some things, you know, well, maybe we could get into some desperate geoengineering strategies. We could go ahead and start putting satellites into the atmosphere that reflect the sun, or, you know, stuff like that, crazy business. You know, it is a long time away, like, it is 2065, we have some time for people to step in and figure stuff out. But, in general, when we're talking about intervening actors, we're saying one of 2 things. Impacts that involve people are less likely than impacts that don't involve people. So any conflict-based scenario, people generally have an incentive not to start wars and are looking for ways to back down, so they often will. Impacts that have to deal with something like environmental destruction, you can't just like back down from the brink. Once you've gotten to the brink, we're kind of there. The other way of deploying intervening actor arguments, and this starts to move into time frame, is to say that impacts that are further away, there's a greater chance of an intervening actor stepping in. So if this impact that you're talking about, so, you know, isn't going to be felt for 30, 40, 50 years, then there's a lot of time for us to develop solutions. So while we can't just like decide to stop global warming in 50 years when it starts getting too crappy, what we could do is, you know, develop new technologies like offshore wind or whatever anytime in the next 50 years. So a sort of comparison that might happen, let's say that the affirmative team is reading the offshore wind data and talking about global warming. It's like global warming is going to kill us all by 2050. We've got to start investing in reducing emissions right now. The other team reads something that's a very short-term, quick disad, like the economy disad. They're like, well, we agree, you got to address global warming, but if you do it like this, you're just going to immediately cause an economic collapse in the short term from electricity prices. So a negative team arguing time frame might say, be like, well, global warming might be bigger, but it's really far away. And the fact that it's really far away means we have a longer time to find solutions to it. If we have a big global conflict from an economic collapse next year, people probably aren't going to be focusing too much on new renewable energies and whatnot. Going to be a little bit distracted by, you know, global war. So it's like we should avoid this really big short-term impact in order to buy us more time to deal with global warming in the future. We got to live to fight another day, basically. So because an impact is further away, there's a greater chance of things happening that will deal with it. Now, you know, you could argue that that's kind of an excuse. It's like people say that about global warming all the time. Like, oh, we don't have to deal with that yet, you know, whatever. We'll get to it eventually. But it is still, in general, true. If something's further away, we do have, you know, some amount of time to deal with global warming. So the further something away is, the less likely that its terminal consequence will happen, because the more likely it is that someone could step in and deal with it. The other ways to sort of talk about time frame are basically the reverse of these structure versus event and things. So when we said that a structural impact is probably more likely or more probable than an event-based impact, the reverse is true in that an event-based impact almost certainly has a quicker time frame than a structural impact. Because a structural impact, it's unclear when this thing is going to happen. When someone says that when someone says that hegemony prevents global conflict, who knows what conflicts would happen if hegemony declines, when they would happen, where they would be. There's no specific prediction, so there's no real time frame to evaluate. When are these conflicts going to happen? Where are they going to be? Who knows? They're likely, it's more likely because it's something that's just structural, but we don't have a very specific time frame to latch onto. Something that has a very specific prediction, like this will happen, China will feel pressure, they'll invade Taiwan, it might be less likely because it involves a bunch of specific steps all coming to fruition, but it does have a very specific time frame. It's something that's more likely to happen quickly. Again, systemic impacts. They are 100% happening right now, so the time frame is immediate. So that sort of example of using a sort of systemic impact like malnutrition or poverty is something that is both more probable and has a quicker time frame because it's something that is immediately present as opposed to something that might happen in the future, but generally smaller in magnitude. So those are sort of, I think, there are other ways. I mean, ultimately, it's up to you all to make any argument you want. You see an impact over here, they have an impact over here. You can come up with a reason why yours is bigger. You can come up with a reason why yours is faster. You can come up with a reason why yours is more likely. I think these are just helpful categories of sort of the most important ways of comparing within categories, comparing which impact has a larger magnitude, which impact has a larger probability, which impact has a quicker time frame. It's also important to discuss interactions between your impact and their impact. And this is something that someone hinted at earlier, and they said, what if your impact causes their impact? And this is sort of a category of what we would call either arguments that the disad turns the case, or arguments that the case turns the disad. And it's basically any interaction that you might have between one of your two impacts. So if someone's impact is economic decline and someone's impact is hegemony, we could compare which one's more likely. They're both structural, they're both pretty big, they both have a time frame, but you could also make the argument that economic power is a prerequisite to military power. If the United States didn't have a powerful economy, we couldn't afford to maintain the military we have, and we also probably wouldn't have the same political leverage globally. So economic strength underwrites military strength. And if that's the case, then an economic decline would also undermine our hegemony. But it's not necessarily the case that if our hegemony declines, that would undermine our economy. So there's more of an interaction between one impact than the other. So this category of argument is very, very important. And I think that these types of arguments often weigh heavily in judges' minds, thinking about the ways that different impacts interact with one another. Other examples that might come up a lot are things that relate the economy to global warming, for example. So a lot of people will say, well, in order for us to deal with global warming, we're going to need to develop a bunch of new technologies, new renewable energies, stuff like that. And in order for that to happen, we need to have strong, consistent economic growth. So if someone's going for an economy disadvantage and saying your act will kill the economy in the short term, they might say that also undermines their ability to deal with global warming, because if we collapse the economy, then there's sort of less investment and business that can exist to promote new renewable technologies. So there are interactions between the economy and global warming. Can anyone think of an interaction the other way? How might global warming impact the economy? Yeah.
Well, if global warming does come to like the peak and there's not, and plants are dying, crops are dying, and there are resource wars, the U.S. might be engaged in resource wars and wars, like as it happened in the French Revolution when the French helped the Americans. Wars can often really harm the economy.
Yeah, and if plants are dying, plants are part of the economy too, so that would probably, agriculture, industry, all that. All of those seem like big ways that could affect the economy. Other ways that global warming could affect the economy?
Decline in public health means like the more people are getting sick, less people are like being able to work and manufacture things.
Yeah, makes sense. More people are getting sick, both because if new areas become tropical, it opens up new disease vectors and just like heat death and whatever.
If we all die from global warming, then there will be no economy?
I mean, in the ultimate case, that definitely is true if we all died. But I'm saying, think, even if the other team wins that global warming wouldn't cause extinction, there are still ways that you could just argue that global warming itself would just negatively impact the economy and access their impacts. So, yeah, Griffin.
Well, global warming could make some areas uninhabitable, cause refugee crisis.
Yeah, refugee crises, those could definitely cause economic problems in various ways. It could also cause more intense storms, bigger hurricanes and stuff. Those tend to be bad for the economy. Blow up a bunch of oil platforms and cities and people's lives and jobs and houses tends not to be good. So it's important to think about first as many different ways as possible that your impact could interact with theirs. Diversity is good here. If you can come up with 4 or 5 or 6 different reasons why your impact might also cause their impact, great. The more the merrier. The more possible interactions. Because these are very threatening arguments. If you can win that your impact not only outweighs but also accesses their impact, you're in a very strong position. You can often win debates even when the sort of ability to solve your impact is smaller, just because your impact has so much interaction with theirs that the judge just cares way more about. So it's important to come up with as many different ways to interact with their impact as possible. The second thing is that you want to interact with as many different levels of their argument as you can. And what I mean by that is you might want to make arguments for why your impact turns their sort of terminal impact. You could also make arguments for why your impact turns their solvency at any level. So, for example, in addition to saying sort of generally that economic decline could undermine investment for renewable energies, which would turn global warming, you could also say that economic decline would not only just generally affect the amount of investment available for renewable energy, but would specifically mean that there wouldn't be enough investment for offshore wind. So keep in mind that the Offshore Wind Act just lifts a restriction, right? It doesn't guarantee money to build offshore wind. It just says we should take away these legal restrictions, and then businesses will step in and invest. Well, sure, the act might have some evidence that says businesses will step in and invest now, but they might be less likely to do so if the economy is in decline and those businesses have less access to capital, etc. So you can kind of turn as many different levels of their argument as you can come up with. So I think it's just kind of a helpful thing. This is often something you can do before a debate. You kind of know what disads you might go for, and you know what act they're going to read. So sit around and just brainstorm 3 or 4 reasons why your impact would cause their impact or prevent their ability to solve their impact. It's a good use of time. With that in mind, the sort of next category is moving from comparing within impacts to comparing between impacts, or between categories. So there's different ways that you can debate which of these impacts has a bigger magnitude. But then we also have to debate what's more important, the size of the impact or the probability of the impact. There's a few different kind of techniques that you could do to do that. A couple of different ways that you could argue that magnitude is the most important. Aha. Human food. The first is basically what I would call, and what particularly Mr. Herndon likes to call, the diamonds are forever philosophy. Basically, this is the idea that any impact that has the risk of actual humans' extinction should outweigh, because, like diamonds, extinction is forever. There's no coming back. It's one thing, even if 5 billion humans died, that would obviously be terrible, but those last 1.5 billion humans could maybe reconstruct human civilization. If every person died, then there's no recovery. There's no coming back. And it not just means that all of those, 6 billion, 7 billion people die. It also means every future life that would have ever been born now no longer gets born. Think about that. If anything less, if 99% of all humans die, people will still continue to be born and live future lives, and the human population will eventually regrow to the same place. But if 100% of people die, no person will ever be born again, and all future lives will be lost. So that is a literal infinite impact. Any impact that accesses extinction is an impact that is qualitatively different from any other impact, because it has the potential to deny literal infinite future lives. So that's a way that you could argue that if your impact accesses or has the risk of accessing human extinction, it should outweigh every other impact because it's just qualitatively different. Every other impact is recoverable on some level and gives people a chance to live future lives. Not the case for human extinction. A sort of subset of this idea is try or die. And this is a somewhat important sort of debate impact comparison concept. But it relies upon a very specific set of conditions being the case. So if the negative is foolish enough to only go for arguments against the case that say the affirmative doesn't solve. So let's say you don't read any inherency arguments, you don't read any impact defense arguments, you just say the app doesn't solve. So let's take the offshore wind app, for example. The offshore wind app, they're saying, we solve global warming. You're going to build offshore wind, and that's going to solve global warming. The negative in this debate does not contest whether or not global warming is happening, does not contest that global warming would cause extinction. The only thing they say is that the affirmative would not be enough to solve global warming. It would only be a tiny reduction in demand. It wouldn't even produce that much offshore wind. Offshore wind, isn't even that great of a technology. It just wouldn't solve that well. But that's the only argument the negative makes. If the negative has only made solvency arguments and hasn't contested the sort of uniqueness or impact of the advantage, then the affirmative can say, well, 100% for sure, we're all going to die now from global warming. The negative has not contested that global warming is happening, and they have not contested that it would cause extinction. They're just saying we don't solve it. So they're agreeing that if you vote for the status quo, you will 100% die. Even if the plan probably doesn't solve, if there's any chance that it solves at all, we have to try it because we're definitely going to die now. So we need to try or die. It is the try or die philosophy. If the status quo is definitely screwed, then we must try even if the chance of solvency is very low. So if you're negative, I would generally advise, if you're going for a counter plan, this argument doesn't make sense anymore. Because it's like, well, you could try the AF, or you could try our counter plan. So it's like, it's no longer like 100% all things are screwed if we don't vote AF. But if the negative is only going for the status quo, if you are not going for a counter plan, you should always have either some impact defense, so some reason why global warming doesn't cause extinction, or you should have some reason why the status quo is solving their impact. If you don't have at least one of those components, you leave yourself susceptible to the old try or die. And if you are the affirmative and you notice that the negative has failed to meet these basic requirements and has not defended the sustainability of the status quo, then you may attempt the try or die. Okay. We used to talk about risk or probability, and to say that that's the most sort of important frame. One idea is basically to criticize the 1% doctrine and call your opponents Dick Cheney. So this is basically the idea that Dick Cheney basically said after 9/11. He was like, well, if there's a 1% risk that terrorists could get nuclear weapons, we have to do everything possible to stop them. Now, Cheney sounds a lot like me 3 minutes ago talking about magnitude. And that's not entirely off base. Because a lot of the debate magnitude appeals, like diamonds are forever, sound a lot like Dick Cheney. It's like, well, if there's a 1% risk that all humans could go extinct, that just qualitatively outweighs everything else. So we need to just throw everything else to the wind and just focus only on this. And that is a kind of sort of crisis politics or a focus on sort of the extreme that potentially distracts us from the sort of day-to-day violence that gets experienced. And so these are sort of categories of arguments that should be made when you are defending a systemic impact against someone else's big extinction impact. So if you're reading an AF that claims to reduce poverty, claims to reduce malnutrition, starvation, etc., and the other team is like, oh yeah, but you would cause a nuclear war, you want to try and kind of frame the other team as being Dick Cheney. You want to be like, this other team is trying to distract you with the war and these tiny 1% risks of war happening and causing extinction, and that's sort of a way, that is a form of impact comparison that causes us to undervalue the sort of things that happen every day and to focus our energies away from solving those sort of important systemic issues in the name of very unlikely catastrophic impacts. And this is even a place where you could read evidence, it could be sort of critique evidence of a sort, that critiques that kind of politics, that says that that approach to risk management is a bad approach to risk management because it causes us to sort of constantly obsess with scenarios that are unlikely and deprioritize things that affect people on a day-to-day basis. If you are trying to say that if you have an impact that is quick and you want to make the debate all about time frame, and you want to say that time frame is the most important thing ever, well, the first thing you can do is you could make the intervening actors argument that I referenced before. An intervening actors argument could both be a reason why one impact is more probable than another impact, but could also be a reason to prefer faster impacts in general. Like I was saying, the further away an impact is, the more time there is for some other solution to come up. If global warming is not going to kill us until 2050, then if we survive the nuclear war next year, we have some time for us to figure out a solution to warming down the road. So we have to live to fight another day. And that sort of rhetoric, intervening actors / live to fight another day, is how you would want to frame the debate if you're the team that has a quick impact and they're the team that has either a bigger impact or whatnot. So anytime you have an impact that is something that will happen immediately, this conflict will happen, there will be a war next year. There was an app that I was reading in high school at one point where we had some cards that were like, Russia will invade Georgia on October 24th because there's this like holiday celebration and they think they'll be vulnerable. And so for like the beginning of the year up until October 24th, when Russia obviously didn't invade Georgia, because this was well before they actually did in 2008, this was in like 2004 or 5 or something. But up until October 24th came, we had a pretty sweet time frame for our app. We're like, our impact happens on October 24th. Incredibly specific. Even if you don't have something that specific, if you have an impact that is very quick, that you have a very specific time frame that you can sort of prioritize it as being immediate, you might want to sort of use this live to fight another day framing to say, hey, even if you think their impact is bigger and sounds worse, our impact is going to happen right now, so let's avoid that first and live to deal with global warming next year. If we're all dead, we're not going to deal with that anyway, so let's avoid the short-term impact and give ourselves time to deal with that other thing down the road. Does that make sense? So with those sort of tools in mind, a couple of sort of general pieces of advice for approaching impact comparison in a debate. When you're asked, impact comparisons should start in the 1AR. Whatever disads the negative has extended, when you're on those disads, when you're talking about those disads, you should make an argument, probably at the beginning, that's just like, our impact, pick whatever advantage you kind of want to focus on, outweighs their impact. So if you're going for the warming advantage and they're going for the econ disad, or if you're going for the warming advantage and they're going for the China disad, be like, our warming impact outweighs their China impact. Then use some of these arguments. Our impact has a bigger magnitude because it's inclusive, because warming would cause resource wars. Our impact is more probable because intervening actors could stop wars between countries, but intervening actors can't stop wars between particles of carbon once they're in the atmosphere. Magnitude should be more important than time frame, because global warming threatens human extinction, and it's try or die, diamonds are forever. If human extinction happens, it's qualitatively different than any other impact. You can kind of build in any of those impacts, how you choose to do that comparison, but you want to start that in the 1AR. And a part of that is you want to focus down your impacts. You want to kind of pick the advantage that you think is best, the impact that's best, the one you think you're winning the most, and focus on comparing that against the impact the neg is going for. If they're going for multiple disads, you should do this multiple times. Do it on one disad, do it on the other disad. Our case outweighs their economy disad. Our case also outweighs their China disad. You want to set that up in the 1AR. It doesn't have to be super elaborate. It can be like 15 seconds. It can just be a quick list of a couple of arguments, but you just kind of want to get those things out there so that the 2AR can kind of lock in and rant. So you don't have to totally sell the judge on try or die. You just got to get it out there so that your 2AR can just give a nice minute-long impassionate appeal about try or die. So you just want to kind of set up the 2AR. How do you pick what you want to focus down on? It's some combination of what are you winning the most, so what advantage are you doing best on, with what impact helps me the most. And that's in terms of, if you're thinking about before the debate, what sort of interactions you have. Does your impact turn their impact? Does your impact include their impact? Are there sort of good comparisons that you can make? So if you have one advantage, let's say that you think you're like, my warming advantage I think is the best advantage impact calculus wise. It gives me good turns case arguments against a lot of things. It's kind of a good big impact to compare. I kind of like going for global warming. So I'm comfortable with that. If the neg is like equally good on both your warming and your oceans advantage, or maybe even if they're a little bit better on your warming advantage than your oceans advantage, you might still decide to go for that, just because even though you're winning more of your oceans advantage, your warming advantage is just more useful for you as an impact calculus tool. It's easier to convince the judge that global warming outweighs economic collapse than like fisheries dying, fish dying outweighs economic collapse. So even if you feel like you're winning a little bit more of your oceans advantage, you might decide to focus down on your warming impact just because it's better. Now that being said, if you're just getting shellacked on your warming advantage, like after the block you're like, oh my god, there is no chance we can win any of this, like we're not solving anything, we're totally toasted, the neg has a counter plan that solves your whole advantage, like they're just doing all sorts of sweet stuff, then even though that impact is better, you might just have to bail and focus on the oceans impact because it's the one you're winning more of. So it's a combination of which of these helps me the most, which is a better impact to have around, and which one am I winning the most. It can't just be one or the other. When you're neg, you want to start your impact calculus in the 2NC. Whatever disad you extend, the first thing you should do at the top of your disad, before you get into the line by line, before, hey, 2AC number 1, answering uniqueness, let's go. Before you get to that, do impact calculus at the top. Just have a nice little 30, 45 seconds even introduction. That's just like, here's why our economy impact is more important than their case. Here's why it turns their case. Here's why it has bigger magnitude. Here's why it's faster. Do all that. And that can be pretty developed. I mean, you have 13 minutes in the negative block to talk about stuff, so you can afford to spend like a minute of that time just doing impact calculus. You'll be okay. And you want to set it up as deeply as possible to save yourself time in the 2NR. The 2NR is a very time-pressured speech. It's one of the hardest speeches in debate. Because the 2NR has to predict every way the 2AR could beat you and close the door. And you have a lot of stuff to deal with. I know a lot of people think they're like, oh, the 1AR is real hard. You get 5 minutes to answer 13 minutes. That's true. But the 2NR is also very hard because you have to answer everything the 1AR says. You don't get to be as selective. So setting up that impact calculus as well as you can in the 2NC will save you time for your 2NR. So in the 2NC, you should always do a nice, healthy, hefty little thing of impact calculus at the top of every disad you extend. You should do it again in the 2NR, but you don't have to like repeat everything you said. If you've done it well in the 2NC, you can just kind of extend stuff. You can be like, you should prefer our impact because it's structural. That was from the 2NC. You can just kind of, you've set yourself up. The last thing I'll say before I let you go. You're going to see a lot of the same impacts in debate over and over. You're going to see global warming impacts, biodiversity impacts, hegemony impacts, economy impacts, proliferation impacts. You'll see a bunch of the same systemic impacts, like disease or poverty, malnutrition, etc. You'll see a lot of the same sort of specific conflict flashpoints that get talked about. India and Pakistan, China and Taiwan, Iran and Israel. Those will come up a lot. Make a list of them. When you see new impacts that you haven't debated before, add it to your list. Just keep a random document somewhere on your computer called Cool Impacts from Debate. Just make a list. And this is something this doesn't change from topic to topic. If you get good at comparing different relative impacts, that is a skill that will be useful on every topic, and it's something that you can prepare for whenever. You can just think about, all right, if I had a hegemony impact, and they had a China-Taiwan war impact, how would I do my impact calculus? You could even write it out, keep it in this little document that has your list of different impacts, and then at some random point in a debate where you find yourself with a hegemony impact against a China-Taiwan war impact, you've already written out your impact calculus. Go grab it. And you can start doing that for a bunch of different scenarios. You could theoretically, if you want to be like really, really complete, do it for every possible combination of every possible impact that would exist. That's probably a little bit unreasonable. But even just doing it for a few is a form of practice of just thinking through the process of how you do that. And if you pick common ones, we'll prepare you for that. On this topic, you will compare economy versus global warming one or the other way a lot of times. Think about how you want to do that. Go ahead and prepare for it both ways. Save yourself that time. Be more prepared. Like Sun Tzu, you should win the battle before you even show up. And with that said, you should win the battle against your lunch. So, enjoy.